Imagine this. You wake up to the ground shaking violently. Within minutes, the ocean retreats impossibly far from shore. Then you see it, a wall of water, taller than any building, racing toward your village at the speed of a galloping horse. You run, you survive, you make it to high ground. But when you come back down, everything is gone. Your rice fields, flooded with salt water, destroyed. Your fishing boats, smashed to splinters, gone. Your food stores, swept out to sea, obliterated. You're alive. But you're standing in the ruins of your livelihood with winter coming and no way to grow food in poisoned soil. This wasn't a hypothetical scenario for coastal Japan. This was reality. Tsunamis struck regularly throughout history, and every time they did, they left survivors facing an impossible question. How do you feed a community when the ocean has just salted your fields and destroyed your food supply? Starvation should have been inevitable. Coastal populations should have collapsed after every major tsunami. But they didn't. Because the samurai-era Japanese had developed something remarkable. A food security system so resilient, so carefully designed, that even catastrophic tsunamis couldn't break it. This is the story of how they did it. How they built insurance against disaster into every aspect of their food system. How they turned their entire landscape into a survival mechanism. No modern supply chains. No disaster relief organizations. No government aid. Just centuries of hard-won wisdom about how to survive when the ocean tries to kill you. Let's dive in. The enemy that erases everything. First, you need to understand what a tsunami actually does to a food system. Because it's not just the immediate destruction. It's the cascade of failures that follows. Japan's geography is a nightmare for coastal communities. The entire archipelago sits on the Pacific Ring of Fire, where tectonic plates collide constantly. When these plates slip during an underwater earthquake, they displace massive amounts of ocean water. That displaced water becomes a tsunami, and tsunamis don't just hit once. Historical records describe waves arriving in sets, 3, 5, sometimes more, each one potentially catastrophic. The first wave might be the largest, or it might be the third. You never knew. When a tsunami strikes a coastal village, here's what happens in sequence. The wave itself destroys everything in its path. Houses, temples, storage buildings, anything within reach of the water is either swept away or smashed apart. People drown, livestock drowns, tools and equipment disappear into the ocean, but that's just day one. The real crisis starts immediately after. Because that tsunami water isn't just water. It's ocean water, salt water, and it doesn't just wash over the land and disappear. It soaks into the soil. Rice, the foundation of Japanese civilization, cannot grow in saline soil. Even small amounts of salt in the ground will kill rice plants or prevent them from growing entirely. A single tsunami could render rice fields useless for years, sometimes decades. So in one catastrophic event, you lose your current food stores swept away, your fishing capability, boats destroyed, your ability to grow rice, fields poisoned, your livestock drowned or scattered, your tools and equipment gone. And you lose all of this right before winter, when you need food stores most, and when replanting is impossible. This is total food system collapse. Modern disaster relief would struggle with this scenario, even with helicopters, aid shipments, and emergency supplies. Samurai Japan had none of that. Just wooden boats, hand tools, and whatever knowledge they'd accumulated about survival. So how did they not starve? The vertical food system. Here's the first brilliant adaptation. Japanese communities didn't put all their food production in one place. They built vertically. Think about typical agricultural societies. You find flat, fertile land near water. You plant your crops there. That's where the food comes from. You build your village nearby for convenience. Japan couldn't afford that simplicity. So, they developed a multi-elevation food system that spread risk across different altitudes. At the bottom, Closest to the coast, rice paddies in the lowlands. Rice needs water, lots of it, and flat land for paddies. The coastal plains were perfect for this. Rice was the caloric foundation of Japanese society, the most important crop. But rice was also the most vulnerable. Tsunamis would destroy it first. Mid-elevation, on the hillsides, dry field crops, millet, barley, buckwheat, soybeans, vegetables. These crops didn't need flooded paddies. They could grow on sloped land that was useless for rice cultivation. They were less productive per acre than rice, but they served as backup. Crucially, these hillside fields were above tsunami reach. The wave might destroy everything below, but these crops survived. Higher up in the mountains, foraging zones, and secondary crops. The forests provided chestnuts, acorns, wild vegetables, mushrooms, and game. Mountain streams had freshwater fish. These weren't primary food sources during good times, but they were always available. And at the very top, above everything, emergency food caches. This vertical distribution wasn't accidental, it was intentional risk management. If a tsunami hit, you lost the rice paddies. That was devastating but expected. However, you still had the hillside crops. You still had the mountain resources. You still had the emergency stores in elevated locations. The food system was designed with redundancy at different altitudes. Knock out the bottom tier, and the upper tiers keep you alive while you recover. But there's more, because Japanese communities took this concept even further. The calendar of survival. Japanese farmers didn't just diversify by location. They diversified by timing. They developed a sophisticated planting calendar that staggered crop maturity throughout the year, ensuring that no single disaster could wipe out an entire year's food production. In tsunami-prone regions, farmers grew multiple crops with different harvest seasons. Early spring, barley and wheat. These were planted in fall, overwintered, and harvested in early spring, before the main rice planting. If a winter tsunami hit, you'd already harvested these. If a spring tsunami hit, the rice hadn't been planted yet, so you only lost seed, not the mature crop. Summer, rice, the main crop. Planted in late spring, harvested in fall. This was the big bet, the caloric foundation. Fall, buckwheat, late vegetables, soybeans. These could be planted after early rice varieties were harvested, using the same fields for a second crop. If something happened to the rice, you still had this. Winter. Preserved foods, plus cold weather crops like certain radish varieties that could overwinter. But here's the clever part. Different rice varieties matured at different rates. Japanese farmers cultivated early, middle, and late rice varieties. Early rice was ready by late summer. Late rice wasn't harvested until mid-fall. This spread the harvest over months, instead of concentrating it in one vulnerable window. If a late summer tsunami hit, you'd already harvested the early rice and stored it in elevated granaries. You'd lose the late rice still growing, but you wouldn't lose everything. This temporal diversification worked like insurance. Not all crops matured simultaneously, so disaster couldn't catch everything at peak vulnerability. And there's another layer. Perennial crops. The crops that survive anything. Japanese communities relied heavily on perennial plants that couldn't be destroyed by a single disaster. Bamboo groves were everywhere in rural Japan. Bamboo shoots were edible, a crucial spring food source. But bamboo also provided construction material, tools, and containers. And here's the key. Bamboo survives tsunamis. The roots run deep. The plants are flexible. Tsunami water rushes through bamboo groves, bending the stalks, but rarely killing them. After the water recedes, the bamboo springs back. Within weeks, new shoots emerge. You can't destroy a bamboo grove with a tsunami. It's too resilient. The same with certain fruit trees, persimmons, chestnuts, plums. These trees had deep root systems and grew on hillsides above tsunami reach. A single mature persimmon tree could produce hundreds of pounds of fruit. Plant them throughout the community, especially on elevated ground, and you have a food source that survives disasters and produces year after year. Japanese communities also cultivated taro and other root vegetables that could survive partial flooding. Even if the leaves died, the roots often survived underground and could be harvested. But the most important perennial wasn't a plant. It was the ocean itself. The ocean, as emergency food supply. Here's the paradox. The same ocean that destroyed your village also saved you from starvation. Tsunamis devastated fishing fleets. Boats were smashed, nets destroyed, equipment lost. But the ocean? The ocean was still full of food. Japanese coastal communities had intimate knowledge of multiple fishing methods, many of which required minimal equipment. Shore fishing needed only a line and hook. You could fashion these from materials scavenged after the disaster. Tide pool harvesting required no equipment at all. At low tide, you walked the exposed rocks and collected shellfish, sea vegetables, small fish, octopus, sea urchins. This was subsistence fishing, not commercial, but it kept you alive. Seaweed harvesting provided both food and fertilizer. Nori, kombu, wakama. These sea vegetables were rich in nutrients and could be harvested from shore or shallow water. They dried well for storage. The key insight: you didn't need sophisticated equipment to extract food from the ocean. Boats and nets made fishing efficient and productive, but they weren't essential for survival. After a tsunami, while the boats were being rebuilt, people reverted to these primitive methods. The ocean had just tried to kill them, and now they were eating from it. But that's survival. And there's something else about the ocean that saved communities. Salt. Tsunamis brought salt water, yes, but they also deposited salt as the water evaporated. Survivors could harvest this salt from the shoreline and fields. Salt was valuable, essential for food preservation. This salvaged salt could be used to preserve fish, vegetables, and other foods, extending their storage life. The tsunami that destroyed your food system also provided the means to preserve whatever food you could scavenge. The storage system that defeated disaster. None of this resilience mattered if you couldn't store food effectively, because Japan's climate had another enemy: humidity. Food spoils quickly in humid environments. Rice, the staple crop, could rot or develop mold within months if stored improperly. After a tsunami, when you desperately needed stored food to survive, spoilage was a death sentence. Japanese communities developed sophisticated storage systems designed to protect food from both natural decay and disaster. Elevated granaries were standard in coastal villages. These weren't just buildings, they were survival infrastructure. Built on tall pillars, often 8 to 10 feet off the ground, these granaries served multiple purposes. The elevation protected stored rice from floodwater from tsunamis and typhoons, ground moisture that caused rot rodents and pests. Casual theft, the design was specific. Raised floors allowed air circulation underneath, preventing moisture buildup. Thick walls provided insulation against temperature swings. Small windows limited pest access while allowing ventilation. Many granaries had thatched roofs that could be quickly removed. If you saw a tsunami coming, you could theoretically remove the roof, exposing the rice to air, rather than letting it become waterlogged if the building was damaged. But here's the crucial part. These granaries were distributed. Villages didn't keep all their rice in one central location. They spread it across multiple storage buildings at different elevations, some near the village for daily access, some higher up the hillside for emergency reserves, some in neighboring valleys. If a tsunami destroyed the lower granaries, the elevated ones survived. If fire broke out, common after tsunamis when cooking fires were disrupted, you didn't lose everything. This distributed storage system was disaster insurance. Never keep all your survival resources in one place. Communities also stored food in multiple forms: fresh rice for immediate consumption, dried rice for medium-term storage, rice converted to mochi, pounded rice cakes for long-term storage, rice fermented into sake, which doesn't spoil and provides calories. Diversifying storage methods meant diversifying failure points. Different preservation techniques meant different vulnerabilities. Spread your bets. The foods that last forever. Japanese survival strategy included specific foods chosen for extreme shelf stability. Dried fish was fundamental. Fish dried in the sun or smoked could last for months or even years. Coastal communities processed massive quantities of fish during good times, creating reserves that could survive disasters. Katsuobushi, dried, fermented, and smoked skipjack tuna, was so hard it resembled wood. You shaved it into flakes for cooking. This product could last indefinitely if kept dry. It was pure concentrated protein and flavor. Umeboshi, pickled plums, lasted for years, even decades. The combination of salt and acidity prevented spoilage. These weren't just food, they were medicine. The acidity helped prevent food poisoning. The salt content helped maintain electrolyte balance. A single umeboshi could make spoiled rice safer to eat by killing bacteria. Miso paste, made from fermented soybeans, was another preservation miracle. The fermentation process created an environment hostile to harmful bacteria. Miso could last for years and provided essential protein and nutrients. Dried seaweed stored almost indefinitely. Just keep it dry and it remained edible for years. The pattern here: Japanese food culture evolved around preservation. Not because preservation was interesting, but because survival demanded it. When the tsunami came, these preserved foods became the difference between life and death. While fresh crops were destroyed and livestock was lost, the dried fish, pickled plums, and miso paste survived in their elevated storage, ready to sustain the community through the recovery period. The community insurance system. Individual preparation wasn't enough. Communities needed collective survival strategies. Japanese villages developed sophisticated mutual aid systems that functioned as disaster insurance. The kumi system organized villages into groups of households, typically 5 to 10 families, that shared responsibility for each other's welfare. If one household was devastated by disaster, the others in their kumi group had obligations to help. This wasn't charity. It was formalized mutual obligation. You helped your neighbors today because you'd need them to help you tomorrow. After a tsunami, kumi groups would share stored food with affected members, pool labor for rebuilding, redistribute tools and equipment, care for orphaned children, and displaced elderly. But there was a larger system too: inter-village networks. Coastal villages formed alliances with inland communities. The coastal villages provided fish, salt, and sea products. The inland villages provided rice, mountain vegetables, and timber. When a tsunami destroyed a coastal village, they had established relationships with inland communities who would provide food and materials for recovery. This wasn't emergency charity. It was fulfilling long-standing reciprocal obligations. These networks were maintained through regular trade relationships, intermarriage between communities, shared religious festivals, documented agreements sometimes enforced by samurai authorities. The samurai class itself played a role here. Local lords understood that their power depended on productive communities. A village destroyed by tsunami that couldn't recover meant lost tax revenue and reduced military capability. So, samurai administrations maintained emergency rice reserves specifically for disaster relief. If a tsunami struck, the lord would distribute rice to affected villages, not from generosity, but from calculated self-interest. You can't collect taxes from starving peasants. This created a 3-tier safety net: individual household storage, village-level kumi mutual aid, regional samurai-administered emergency reserves. Each tier provided backup if the previous one failed. The fast-growing emergency crops recovery. After a tsunami required getting food production restarted as quickly as possible. But rice paddies poisoned with salt water couldn't grow rice for years. So Japanese farmers had backup crops specifically chosen for speed and salt tolerance. Buckwheat was the emergency crop of choice. It matured in as little as 10 to 12 weeks from planting. If a tsunami hit in spring, you could plant buckwheat immediately and harvest it by late summer, fast enough to prevent starvation. Buckwheat also tolerated poor soil better than rice. It would grow in mountainous areas on rocky ground, in conditions where rice would fail. After a tsunami destroyed the good lowland rice paddies, you could plant buckwheat on marginal land and get a harvest. Millet and barnyard grass were similar, fast-growing grains that tolerated poor conditions. They weren't as nutritious or desirable as rice, but they kept you alive. Radishes matured quickly and could be eaten fresh or pickled for storage. Some varieties could be harvested within 60 days of planting. Sweet potatoes, introduced to Japan in the early 17th century, became another crucial backup crop. They produced edible roots in just 4 to 5 months and yielded far more calories per acre than rice. They also tolerated poor soil and could even handle slightly saline conditions better than rice. The strategy was clear. Immediately after disaster, plant fast-growing crops on any available land, get something, anything, producing food before winter. Meanwhile, you worked on the long-term recovery of the rice paddies, healing the poisoned earth. Restoring salt-damaged rice paddies was a multi-year process. Japanese farmers developed specific techniques for this. The first step, flooding and draining. You flooded the fields with fresh water from mountain streams, then drained it, carrying away dissolved salt. You repeated this process multiple times. Each cycle leached more salt from the soil. But this required water infrastructure, irrigation channels, drainage systems that had to be rebuilt after the tsunami destroyed them. This was a massive community labor project, often taking months. While the fields were being leached, farmers would plant salt-tolerant crops as soil healers. Certain grasses and plants could extract salt from soil through their roots. You'd plant these, let them grow, then remove them, taking the accumulated salt with them. Composting and soil amendment was crucial. Farmers would collect seaweed, deposited by the tsunami, mix it with other organic matter, and work it into the soil. This added nutrients and improved soil structure, helping the recovery process. Some fields might take 3 to 5 years to fully recover. During this time, they could grow less salt-sensitive crops or remain fallow while being treated. The patience required was enormous. You couldn't rush soil recovery. But while waiting, you had those hillside fields, those mountain resources, those emergency crops, and those community networks keeping you alive. The knowledge that couldn't be destroyed. Here's something crucial that modern people often miss. The most important survival resource wasn't food or tools or buildings. It was knowledge. Japanese communities maintained detailed knowledge about which plants could be eaten from the mountains, which fish were safe and abundant in different seasons, how to identify water sources, how to construct emergency shelters, how to preserve food without equipment, which soils recovered quickly from salt damage. This knowledge was passed down orally and through practice. Children learned by doing. Every generation practiced the skills their ancestors had developed. When a tsunami destroyed everything physical, this knowledge survived in the minds of the survivors. You couldn't destroy it. You couldn't wash it away. An elderly person who knew which mountain plants were edible was worth more than gold after a disaster. A fisherman who could read the tides and currents could feed dozens. A farmer who understood soil recovery could restore the community's food production. Communities that valued and preserved this knowledge survived. Communities that lost it perished. This is why education wasn't just for samurai or monks. Every person needed survival knowledge, because every person might need to use it. The tsunami stones and the memory of disaster. Japanese communities did something else remarkable. They recorded disaster. Throughout tsunami-prone regions, you can still find stone markers placed by survivors. These tsunami stones mark the highest point the wave reached, often with inscriptions warning future generations. Do not build below this point. High dwellings ensure peace for descendants. Remember the Great Tsunami. These weren't just memorials. They were survival instructions passed across centuries. Communities that respected these warnings and built above the marked lines survived later tsunamis. Communities that ignored them, that forgot the lessons, suffered again. The 2011 Tohoku tsunami devastated modern cities that had been built in low-lying coastal areas, in places where ancient tsunami stones warned against settlement. Meanwhile, some villages that had heeded centuries-old stone warnings survived because they'd built on high ground. This is intergenerational knowledge transfer through the simplest possible medium: stone markers that outlast any written record. The stone said, "We died, so you don't have to. Learn from us." And the communities that listened survived. When the ocean takes everything, let's be clear about something. This system didn't prevent suffering. People still died. Communities still faced hunger. Recovery was brutal, but they survived. And that's what matters. Throughout the samurai period, tsunamis struck Japanese coastal communities repeatedly. Historical records document dozens of major events. Each time, communities faced the same crisis: destroyed fields, lost boats, poisoned soil, winter coming. And each time, they employed the same strategies: retreat to elevated food sources, rely on distributed food storage, activate community mutual aid networks, plant emergency, fast-growing crops, begin soil recovery processes, extract food from the ocean despite losses, draw on preserved food stocks, share knowledge and labor. They didn't just survive through luck. They survived through systematic preparation and cultural practices refined across generations. The samurai class understood this. Military strength meant nothing if your agricultural base collapsed. Regional lords invested in disaster preparation not from compassion, but from practical necessity. Villages that maintained proper storage, preserved community knowledge, and honored mutual aid obligations recovered. Those that didn't often disappeared from the historical record entirely. What modernity forgot. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Modern food systems are incredibly fragile. We've optimized for efficiency, not resilience. We grow single crops across vast areas. We depend on complex supply chains. We store food in centralized warehouses. We've forgotten how to preserve food without refrigeration. Most people don't know which wild plants are edible. When disaster strikes modern communities, we expect emergency services to arrive. We expect aid shipments. We expect the government to solve the problem. Samurai Japan had none of that, so they built resilience into the foundation of their society. After the 2011 tsunami, some of the most successful recovery stories came from rural communities that still maintained traditional practices. Distributed food storage in elevated locations, knowledge of wild food sources, strong community mutual aid networks, multi-generation farming knowledge. These communities didn't recover because of modern advantages. They recovered because they'd preserved ancient survival strategies. Meanwhile, modern cities and towns that depended entirely on centralized systems and external aid struggled for years. The lesson isn't that we should abandon modern technology. The lesson is that efficiency and resilience aren't the same thing. Sometimes the old, inefficient ways survive precisely because they're redundant, distributed, and low-tech. You can't hack a stone granary. You can't disrupt a network of community obligations. You can't break knowledge that lives in practice and memory. the system that survives. So here we are, 5,000 words into the story of how Samurai Japan avoided starvation after tsunamis. And what have we learned? We've learned that survival isn't about any single strategy. It's about layers of redundancy, each one providing backup when others fail. We've learned that true food security comes from diversity, diverse locations, diverse timing, diverse crops, diverse preservation methods, diverse knowledge holders. We've learned that the most resilient systems are often the simplest ones. Not because complexity is bad, but because complex systems have complex failure modes. When disaster strikes, you need solutions that work with minimal resources. We've learned that communities matter more than individuals. No single household could survive a tsunami alone. But interconnected communities with mutual obligations could weather almost anything. We've learned that knowledge is the ultimate survival tool. Physical resources can be destroyed, but knowledge lives in minds and hands, ready to rebuild what was lost. And we've learned that preparation isn't paranoia, it's respect for reality. The Japanese didn't prepare for tsunamis because they were pessimistic. They prepared because they were realistic. They knew the ocean would eventually try to kill them. So they built their entire society with that certainty in mind. Western cultures often see disaster preparation as weakness, an admission that you can't control your environment. Japanese culture saw it as strength, an acknowledgement that you understand the world and your place in it. There are two ways to approach catastrophic risk. You can pretend it won't happen. You can build for efficiency and hope disaster never comes. You can depend on systems and structures that only work when everything goes right, or you can accept that disaster is inevitable. You can build redundancy into everything. You can preserve knowledge and practice skills you hope you'll never need. You can create networks of mutual obligation that activate when catastrophe strikes. For centuries, Japan chose the second path, not because they wanted to, but because geography gave them no choice. Every tsunami taught the same lesson. The ocean is stronger than you. You can't fight it. You can't predict it. You can't prevent it. But you can survive it if you prepare. Plant your crops at different elevations. Store your food in multiple locations. Preserve what you can. Maintain your knowledge. Honor your obligations to your neighbors. Remember the disasters of the past. Mark the high waterline for future generations. Do these things, and when the ocean takes everything, you'll still have enough to rebuild. This is the wisdom encoded in elevated granaries, in tsunami stones, in fermented soybeans and dried fish, in community obligations and emergency crop calendars. This is how Samurai Japan avoided starvation after tsunamis. Not through any single brilliant innovation, but through a comprehensive cultural system that treated disaster as normal and preparation as necessary. While other societies gambled on disaster never coming, Japan built a civilization that assumed it would. And when the waves came, and they always came, that preparation made the difference between extinction and survival. The ocean tried to starve them. The poisoned earth tried to starve them. Winter tried to starve them. But the system held. The knowledge remained. The communities endured. And life continued. Because survival was never about avoiding disaster. It was about knowing exactly what to do when disaster arrived.